Now, in this video, we will talk about the do-while loop, the third type of loops that we will see. In the do-while loop, and we have already seen, just a quick recap, we have already seen the for loop with this way of structure. We have seen the while loop with that structure here. And then the third one is going to be the do-while loop. And the way we read the do-while loop is do the following code and repeat it while the condition is true. All right. So to understand the difference, we will have to see here what or how the do while is structured. And the way it's structured is that you have the do keyword, and then we can put here sysout, and I can put inside here hello from inside the do while loop. And then I will need to have here a while condition. And that while condition is going to be controlled. So how do I control it? Similar to the for, similar to the end, the while, you will need some kind of a counter. So I'm going to create a counter called j, initialize it to 0, and say while j is less than or equal to 4. All right, so a couple of things here that you need to understand. Unlike for loop and while loop, where you should not put semicolon, and we actually mentioned that putting semicolon here or here is going to cause your code to run only one time, right? It terminates your code, all right? And it's going to run this loop just one time, okay? So you cannot put a semicolon here. However, for the do while loop, and let's get rid of the for loop for now, just to focus on these two. On the other hand, for the do while loop, the way it's written is that you have to put a semicolon at the end. Otherwise, it's going to be a compile time error, syntax error. All right. So that here, the way it should work. I don't know if you are seeing it or not, but if I run, I'm going to get an infinite loop, right? Why? Because I created a counter and then I did not increment that one. So I need to put here j++. All right. So in this case, if you look at these two, this ran 5 times and this ran 5 times, correct? So in this sense, you cannot see the difference between the two. Both of them are working the same way. Now, the thing is, notice that we say while true, repeat, do this while true. So what if it's false, right? So if we put here that is equal to 5, and 5 is not less than or equal to 4. So it should be while false, don't go inside, don't print anything from inside the while loop. But is that going to be the case for the do while loop? And the answer is no. It's actually going to print it one time. So how or why? The thing is, while false is going to print, it's going to skip this whole loop and it's not going to print anything. On the other hand, when j is equal to 5 here, I go and say do this, do the following code, print the following, do the following thing of printing one time with no conditions attached, nothing. So do this code, but do not repeat if it's false. And that's why it ran for one time. So I did this code one time, I incremented j to become 6, 6 less than or equal to 4, no, I'm not going to go back, done. Does that make sense? So in this case, even though I have a condition that is violated from the beginning, however, I actually print or do this code before I check the condition anyway. And that's why the while loop is called a pre-test loop, because it tests before, and the do while loop is a post-test loop. All right, so that's the big difference between the while and the do while loop. All right. Okay, so when do we use the do while loop? The answer is from the functionality of the do while loop. If you have a code that needs to run one time without any conditions, before you start to check a condition, use the do while loop. All right. And to see this, we are going to continue with the same example that we had before, which is to prompt the user for a password and to see how this works. So if you remember from the while loop, we had this example before using the while loop. Let's add the scanner, which we need here. Scan is equal to new scanner system dot in. And the question that I like to ask is, I'm going to declare this variable first. I know I'm going to use this variable, and then I'm going to remove this one. So that makes it a little bit more clear when I ask my question. All right. And my question is, what do you see here that is redundant? And redundant means repeated code that you can see here. So if you look at this, you will find that 12 and 13 are exactly identical to 17 and 18. All right. They are the same code. So what does that mean? The way the logic here is working is that I had to prompt the user for a password at the beginning to be able to go inside this loop and check this condition first. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to ask, what is the user enter password? And if it's, and of course here, this is not, that was, I copied the wrong code. This is dot equals. All right. So I'm trying to ask here, are they equal or not? Right? So while they are not equal, keep repeating the code. All right. So to be able to ask if they are equal or not, I have to have a value first. So that's why I had to prompt the user for an input first to be able to compare it with the correct password. So the thing is, if you have to run the code first time without any conditions, right? That's exactly the definition of the do while loop. I have to run the code one time before I prompt the user for an input without any conditions. That's it. So in this case, this will be my condition to repeat. And what I could do is that I could remove this part. And I could say here, do while this is true. Now, this is going to introduce one problem. The problem is, this means I'm going to run this whole code first time without any conditions. That's perfectly fine. But the problem is it says incorrect password, please try again. So in that case, it's going to give me for the first attempt, and that can be frustrating, that I did not enter the right password. I haven't even tried first time, right? So in this case, but if I go and give it the correct password, it's going to tell me welcome, and it's going to run exactly the same. And it's going to work perfectly fine. All right. So the problem is with that print message, right? Which in that case, I could either sacrifice by removing completely and just keep prompting for the correct path for the password, right? Disk45 is welcome. And here I could run it again and say disk55 disk. So I'm prompting you again, but I'm not printing that message that, hey, the password is wrong, right? Now, what if I wanted and insist on printing that message? I want to still print that message. So there are a couple of ways to do this. One way of them is to be able to keep a counter that says like, hey, which attempt is this, right? So here's an attempt that is equal to 1, because that's the first attempt, right? And every time you enter the password, I'm going to account this or account for that attempt by incrementing my attempt by 1. And I'm going to say that, hey, if you are going to repeat and come back to print that error message, only do this if the attempt is greater than 1. So attempt is equal to 1. Do this. Is attempt greater than 1? No. Don't print this message. Go inside, ask the user, take the password, increment attempt becomes 2. And then I ask, is it correct or not? If it's correct, I'm not going to go back anyway, so I don't care. And then I'm going to go and print welcome. If it's incorrect, I will go back and say like, hey, 2, is it greater than 1? And the answer is yes, it is. Then I'm going to print incorrect password, please try again. Let's see if that works. So here, the first attempt, it did not take from me the, it didn't say the wrong password thing or incorrect password, but now look at this. Now it works. All right. So that here is going to work perfectly fine. No problems. So that's exactly the do while loop, which is different from the while loop in the sense that you run the code one time and then you start to check the condition as you go and try to loop. So in general, the third question is, when do I use the do while loop? That exactly is the scenario. And this scenario has a name for it. It's called input validation. All right. So when you have input validation where you want to validate the input of a user, you have to prompt the user for the input first before you start to process and check if it's correct or not. That is called input validation. And in general, whenever you use input validation, do while loop makes perfect sense to work with them. All right. So we have seen for loop, we have seen while loop, we have seen the do while loop. And in general, just to tell you, most of the time, you are going to use the for loop. All right. Maybe 80%. All right. And that includes the for and the for each, which we are going to talk about later. And then while loop maybe will account for the next or the rest of the 20%. All right. And then you have the do while loop. That is maybe, just to make it make sense. Oops, 19. Maybe 1%, if any. All right. So just to get sense, but again, it's very important to know what do while loop, how it's a post-test and post-test compared to the pre-test while loop. What are the differences? Even if you're not going to use it practically, at least you need to know it for interview purposes. All right, so that's it.